It's Ramsey Dewey over here in Shanghai, China. Today, let's talk about three things that make you think that MMA fighters have sloppy technique. Because I see comments like this constantly with people who don't actually know how to fight. They think they do, like all men who've never been in a fight seem to. And they will throw out this accusation that MMA fighters have sloppy technique. This comes from three places. I'll put those out right away: movies, bad coaching, and sport-specific tendencies from sports that are not mixed martial arts. That last one is the most understandable. We'll get to that in a minute. Let's break this down. Movies. Hollywood stunt choreography has tainted your mind with some very, very silly ideas about how fights are supposed to work. It's trained you how to think, how to see, how to understand a fight in much the same way that professional wrestling trains its audience to accept certain submissions. A perfect example of this is Ronda Rousey. When she was fighting in the UFC, we saw her arm bars were incredible. This is a woman who knows the arm bar so well she can arm bar people in her sleep. Textbook. When she made the transition to the WWE, performance professional wrestling, her signature move, the armbar, well, she changed it. She changed it to make it more audience friendly, to make it more spectacular. But if you look at the way she does it in the WWE, it's not a functional armbar anymore. It's a move with a lot of motion, a lot of flailing around, because the audience is trained to see that the fighter, the wrestler on the receiving end of the submission, is generally panicking and flailing and screaming, and so there has to be some wiggle room for the movement. In a real armbar, you're pinned. There's no space. There's not much wiggle room at all if you're doing it right. And so, when she became a sports entertainment professional wrestler, Ronda changed the armbar technique to fit the established narrative of what the WWE audience is trained to expect and to accept. Ken Shamrock wrote about this concept in his book, Into the Lion's Den, I think it was called. He compared wrestling in Japan versus pro wrestling in America. He did both. In his WWF days, for example, there was a certain set of moves that American audiences are trained to accept as being the dangerous moves. Generally, upper body holds, grabbing the head and twisting the head in certain ways, for example. The camel clutch. There's a classic one. The iron claw. Things like that. When he went to Japan to wrestle there, still pro wrestling, performance wrestling, he noticed the audience was trained in a different narrative. The moves that they accept as dangerous tend to be leg locks, leg entanglements, these sorts of things that the American audience at the time didn't really see as super dangerous, even though they actually are. Movies and fight choreography train us in a similar way. Think about Bruce Lee. In all of his classic movies, he followed a very old trope that he learned from his father, who was an opera performer. And we see this trope throughout Hong Kong Kung Fu cinema. We see it in Bruce Lee's movies as well. We see it in Jean-Claude Van Damme's movies. And we see it in modern Hollywood fight choreography as well. And that is the pose. Posing. Yeah. Real fights are pretty chaotic, and we often see a bunch of techniques happen all in fluid succession, and we tend to call it a scramble because we want to stop and take pictures of individual moves in our mind, but fights don't work that way. They just kind of flow and they happen. But fight choreography happens in poses. Ha! 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 Do you remember when Bruce Lee did that? he'd throw a punch and then squeeze his fist and kind of shake it and make some noise. Ha! To emphasize this is a power move, because we've been trained to accept that type of motion on the screen, ha! As powerful. Now, in some of the earlier takes in Bruce Lee's films that hit the cutting room floor, and if you're a big enough Bruce Lee fan, you might be able to dig some of these up, you can see he tried to make it as realistic as possible by making his punches and kicks fast. But the problem with that is you don't see the pose. And on an old film camera, filming at 24 frames per second, that is just a motion blur. We don't see anything. There's no cool shape to process. And because of that, you see Bruce Lee slow his own movement down and strike poses. Ha! Or he holds out that sidekick. Ha! There's a commonly repeated myth that Bruce Lee moved so fast that they had to slow the film down. That's actually untrue. Bruce slowed his own movement down, and so did his co-stars. It's not that Bruce was so incredibly fast that a film camera couldn't catch up to him. It's that if we're filming at 24 frames per second, and right now I'm filming at 30 frames per second, so even faster, so this should be able to pick up even more. Even that, I'm not even trying to move exceptionally fast, that's just back and forth, back fist, is a motion blur. Now imagine a guy who's trying to be extra super fast, like Bruce Lee, trying to move as fast as humanly possible. Yeah, we're not going to see the shapes, and the audience isn't going to accept it. We are not trained to accept motion blurs as anything. We want to see the shape. Ha! 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 Beijing-style opera, man. If you're not familiar with it, it's nothing like Italian or French or even English opera, where it's most about singing and sometimes dancing. Opera means arts. It means arts, multiple arts. And in the case of classical Western opera, we bring together arts of music, singing, orchestra, ballet, costume, all this other stuff comes together to create one cohesive performance. So opera works. Beijing-style opera, Shanghai-style opera, Chengdu-style opera, all these Chinese-style operas, the thing they have in common is it's multiple styles of work: acting, singing, martial arts, gymnastics, acrobatic movement, all strung together into one cohesive work. So it looks and sounds radically different from its Western contemporaries, but yeah. What did they have in common with the fight choreography? There's a drum beating, bong, 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 and the actors move to the drum beat, bong, 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 and they strike poses to the drum beat. They move and then pa, they pose. They move, boom, and they pose according to the drum beat. And we still see that style of movement even today. We have been trained in the West to accept Hong Kong film tropes that came from Chinese opera. Let's get to the next one. Bad coaching. Reason number 2 out of the 3 things that make you think MMA techniques look sloppy, and why MMA fighters think your technique actually sucks and blows eggs simultaneously. Reason number 2 is bad coaching. And this usually comes in the form of a coach that is very pedantic about form, which we see a lot in traditional martial arts. The coach that says it's not right unless it looks exactly like I tell you. And traditional martial artists tend to have a lot of instructors like this who yell at them because their wrist is 2 centimeters too low or something like that, or their foot is 1 centimeter off position. And if you ask them why does that matter, most of them can't even tell you. They'll just tell you, it must be this way, because it is, because I say so. Now, this is not to say that small differences in movement don't make a big difference overall. They do. They really do. We sometimes talk about invisible jiu-jitsu in Brazilian jiu-jitsu to describe movements that you can feel pretty easily, but they're hard to describe. And this is a problem a lot of martial artists run into, is lacking the vocabulary to adequately teach movement, specifically subtle movement. And I think it is largely because of this that we end up with a lot of these woo-woo chi wackos who will purport to possess supernatural powers because they heard a story. They heard a story from somebody who lacked the vocabulary to explain the correct subtleties of movement, either verbal or movement vocabulary or both. And they lacked the pedagogical skills to convey that information correctly. And so instead they said, well, just use your chi. You know, if you focus really hard and tighten up your core and wiggle your toes and twist your tongue and use your chi, then you can hit harder or something like that, because that's what it feels like. We often run into the trap of trying to explain what it feels like instead of explaining what's actually happening. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Blink, told a story about studying tennis coaches. And he watched how the tennis coaches would teach and what they would say to the athletes. And he compared that with slow motion filming of what was actually going on. And the coaches would say, I forget which swing it was, a certain swing, overhand or underhand or backhand or something. They would say, to do it a certain way. And they would all say this. They would all repeat the same language, use the same vocabulary. But when you replayed the video of what was actually happening in slow motion, you could clearly see that what the coaches were describing wasn't happening at all. And when confronted with this information, the coaches would say, well, that's what it feels like. And when I say this, most of the time, this cue seems to get the right results. We see a lot of nonsense verbal cues in a lot of physical culture, actually. Think about yoga, for example. A lot of yoga teachers, English-speaking ones anyway, will use some absurd expressions to convey points, and sometimes these are well received. They'll say things like, open up your heart. And what they mean by that is basically relax certain parts of your back and open up your chest, meaning spread your pectoral muscles in a certain way without tensing up the chest, essentially contract the back, contract your scapulas. They'll use expressions like be soft when they mean to not flex your feet, for example, or if they do want you to flex the feet, they might say some silly contrived thing. We'll see this in all kinds of different traditions. I think some of the best verbal cues, some of the best use of coaching vocabulary I've seen in any physical discipline is from weightlifting coaches. And this is fascinating because it's two movements, basically, the clean and jerk and the snatch, two ways to get the heaviest weight possible from the lowest point possible to the highest point possible, from the floor to overhead. And you would think, after all of this time, there would be one set of expressions to convey what is relatively simple information. I don't want to oversimplify this because there are a lot of subtle nuances, even in just those two movements. And so I think because of that, because we're dealing with essentially two movements, and maybe a few variations of each, then we can expect a better use of vocabulary. Contrast that with, say, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or any martial art where we have hundreds of movements, hundreds of potential ways to move. And many of those ways haven't really been studied very closely, not at a scientific level, not at a level where you are attempting to win in the Olympics, for example, but rather at a bro science level at best, and a woo-woo chi nerd level at worst. So bad coaching comes in a bunch of different forms, but the specific type of bad coaching I'm referring to here is guys who over-fixate on how pretty the form is, not how functional the form is, but how pretty it is. So they'll look at an MMA fighter, and they will see him do something like, let's say, throw a kick in a way that is different than a kick is thrown in a taekwondo form. And if you look at an average Muay Thai fighter, the way they would throw a roundhouse kick and the way they might move their arms while throwing a roundhouse kick is completely inconsistent with the way a kick is taught in a taekwondo form. The arms move in a completely different way. If you get a very rigid structured taekwondo teacher from the World Taekwondo Federation teaching you a roundhouse kick and ask them what to do with the arms, it's going to be a completely different answer than what a Muay Thai fighter will offer. Compare that with how MMA fighters will throw their kicks. Many different ways. Why? Because MMA fighters are not one thing. They are thousands of different martial artists from many different martial arts backgrounds, mixing multiple martial arts, competing in one rule set. I digress, because there actually are multiple mixed martial arts rule sets. The UFC, for example, uses unified rules. ONE FC, for example, uses universal mixed martial arts rules, and so on. But this brings us to point number 3. In the list of 3 things that make you think that MMA techniques look sloppy and why MMA fighters think your technique actually sucks and blows eggs simultaneously. Sport-specific tendencies that don't cross over to MMA. I would say the perpetrators of this who are most guilty are boxers. More specifically, casual boxers, not the serious ones. I would say any serious boxer who's been in a few fights respects what a fight is and respects what can happen in a fight, and realizes that there are a ton of variables involved in any type of fight. However, a casual boxer, somebody who maybe trains in boxing a few times a week, maybe he's done some amateur fights, maybe not though, probably not, will have a lot more to say about the subject, especially regarding the position of an MMA fighter's hands. They will scream at the TV screen, "Keep your hands up." Why won't they keep their hands up? Scree, why doesn't he have a high guard the whole entire time? Well, friend, mixed martial arts is a very different sport than boxing. In boxing, you don't have to worry about takedowns, for example. And this is one of the biggest reasons why hand position will be radically different in a mixed martial arts fight versus a boxing match. For example, in an MMA fight, there are huge strategic advantages to having a low lead arm and a high lead shoulder and a high backhand, similar to, say, a Philly shell. But that Philly shell type position will be used in very different ways than it will be in boxing. For example, in boxing, the shoulder is used as a guard, same as you would use it in MMA. Here's a guard. The arm can protect the body, and you can use this to close distance in certain ways, to create separations in certain ways, to create certain angles. A bunch of cool strategies can be developed around that, but the ultimate objective is punch the other guy and don't get punched. In mixed martial arts, however, that low lead arm serves a very different purpose. to get an underhook or a crossface to stop a takedown. If your hands are up high, if you've got a high guard the whole time, maybe you got a Muay Thai long guard, or you got your hands up here in like a peekaboo sort of stance, or you just don't know what to do with your hands, so they're just generally up here. Your lower body is completely undefended, and you will be taken down by anybody with a modicum of wrestling experience. So it's important to remember, what looks sloppy to you in one sport, because it might not be an optimal strategy in the sport of boxing, actually can be an optimal strategy in mixed martial arts. And what looks crisp and clean and perfect in one sport is going to be terrible technique in another sport. So that's about it, friends. Thank you for watching. Now get out there and train.